The windshield wipers of Eleanor Martinez's 2015 Honda Civic fought desperately against the torrential rain as she navigated through the dark streets of suburban Denver. At 73, she'd driven through countless Colorado storms, the infamous blizzard of '97 that shut down the entire Front Range, the hailstorm of 2009 that destroyed half her garden, the flash floods that turned streets into rivers. But tonight felt different. The lightning seemed angrier, cracking across the sky like God's own whip, the thunder more violent, shaking her small car with each boom, and the rain fell like bullets against her windshield, each drop exploding into a star of water that her wipers couldn't clear fast enough. She squinted through the darkness, her arthritic hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than they had in years, searching for the familiar outline of her son David's house. The GPS on her phone kept cutting out too much interference from the storm, but she knew these streets by heart. She'd driven this route every Sunday for years, back when Sunday dinners were a tradition, back when family meant something more than obligatory holiday cards. Their 2,847 Maple Ridge Drive. The house materialized through the sheets of rain like a beacon, its colonial facade barely visible in the storm's fury. The same house she'd helped him buy 15 years ago with Robert's life insurance money, $80,000 that was supposed to be their retirement cruise fund, their golden years safety net. Instead, she'd handed it over without hesitation when David said he'd found the perfect home for his growing family. "Mom, this is it," he'd said, standing in the empty living room with Sarah beside him, both of them glowing with the excitement of young parenthood. "This is where we'll raise Emma and Jake. This is where they'll have Christmas mornings and birthday parties. This is where you'll come for Sunday dinners when you're old and gray." They'd all laughed at that last part. 73 had seemed impossibly far away then. Now Eleanor was old and gray, and the Sunday dinners had stopped coming sometime around when David's business took off, when success became more important than family traditions, when her son transformed from the boy who used to call her every day into a stranger who couldn't find 5 minutes to return her calls. Eleanor pulled into the driveway behind David's black BMW, a newer model than the one she remembered. Sleek and expansive-looking, probably worth more than she spent in 2 years. The contrast wasn't lost on her. Her practical, aging Honda beside his symbol of success, both vehicles getting equally soaked by the same indifferent storm. Her heart raced, not from the storm, but from the conversation she needed to have. She'd been calling him for weeks about the issues with her medications, the insurance company's refusal to cover her new heart medication, the maze of Medicare supplemental plans that changed rules faster than she could learn them. But it wasn't just medical issues. The problems had started small and grown like cracks in a foundation. First, it was the loneliness that had been eating her alive since Robert passed 2 years ago. The silence in the house that had once been filled with his terrible morning singing, his evening news commentary, his gentle snoring that had annoyed her for 45 years of marriage but now kept her awake with its absence. Then came the practical concerns. The furnace that made strange noises in the night, the ice dam on the roof that she couldn't safely clear herself, the financial advisor who spoke in acronyms and assumptions, presuming she had adult children who were involved in her life. Each call went to voicemail, each text remained unanswered. Each attempt to connect with her only child was met with the digital equivalent of silence. But tonight was different. Tonight she'd driven across town in the worst storm of the year because she couldn't wait any longer. The doctors had been clear during her appointment 3 days ago. Her heart condition was worsening faster than expected. Dr. Richardson had used words like advancing and complications and end-stage considerations. He'd handed her a thick packet of forms and referrals, speaking in the gentle but direct tone that medical professionals reserve for patients who need to get their affairs in order. "Mrs. Martinez, you're going to need help navigating these decisions," he'd said, his kind eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Do you have family? Someone who can be your advocate?" She'd nodded and said yes, of course, my son David, but sitting in the medical parking lot afterward, she'd realized she was lying. When was the last time David had been to a doctor's appointment with her? When had he last asked about her health beyond the perfunctory, "How are you feeling?" In their increasingly rare conversations, David was her only child, her only family, left in this world, and she was about to ask him to help her prepare for the possibility of dying. The weight of that conversation, the vulnerability it required, the admission that she needed him had taken her 3 days to work up the courage to drive across town. The rain hammered against her car roof like thousands of tiny fists as she gathered her courage in her purse. Through the storm, she could see warm light glowing from David's living room windows, the same windows she'd helped him install when the house was still new, when he'd still asked for her advice, when Her presence was welcome rather than merely tolerated. She imagined him inside with Sarah and their 2 teenage kids, probably watching a movie on the big screen TV he'd shown off during her last visit 6 months ago. Safe and dry and completely unaware that his mother was about to step into a hurricane. For him, Eleanor pulled her coat tight, the same navy wool coat Robert had bought her for their 40th anniversary. Still sturdy but showing its age in the way the buttons had loosened and the collar had begun to fray. She made a run for the covered porch, her sensible shoes splashing through puddles that had formed in the driveway's uneven spots. By the time she reached the front door, her silver hair was plastered to her head in wet tendrils and her clothes were soaked through to her skin. She could feel water dripping down her back, cold and shocking. She rang the doorbell, the familiar chime echoing inside the house, a sound she'd heard hundreds of times over the years, usually followed by the thunder of grandchildren's feet racing to see who was visiting. But tonight there was no rush of footsteps, no excited voices calling grandma's here. She waited, counting seconds, then knocked, when no one came. The sound of her knuckles against the wood she'd helped David stain during one of their weekend project sessions years ago was almost lost in the thunder that rolled overhead like a freight train. "David," she called out, raising her voice above the storm's roar. Rain dripped from her hair into her eyes, making her blink rapidly. "It's Mom." She pressed closer to the door, trying to use the small porch overhang for protection, but the wind whipped the rain sideways, soaking her from angles she couldn't shield against. Her purse, clutched tight against her chest, was already drenched despite being leather. Inside it were the medical forms Dr. Richardson had given her, probably ruined now, along with the printed screenshots of all her unanswered calls to David that she'd brought as evidence of how hard she'd been trying to reach him. She could hear movement inside, footsteps across hardwood floors, the muffled sound of voices, the telltale click of the television being muted. Her heart lifted slightly. Of course they were home. Of course David would open the door and pull her inside. His face creased with concern and surprise. He'd apologize for not returning her calls, explain that he'd been busy with work, make her a cup of tea while she dried off in the warm kitchen where she'd taught him to cook scrambled eggs when he was 8 years old. The footsteps approached the door, deliberate and unhurried. Eleanor smoothed her wet hair with one hand, preparing her smile despite the circumstances. She'd keep it light at first, joke about the weather, compliment Sarah on the new flowers she'd noticed in the front garden beds, ask about Emma's art classes and Jake's soccer season. Then, when they were all settled and comfortable, she'd ease into the real reason for her visit. "David, honey, it's Mom," she called again, her voice carrying the mix of authority and affection that had shaped him from toddlerhood through adulthood. "I'm sorry to come by so late, but I really need to talk to you about something important." The porch light flickered on above her head, casting her shadow against the white-painted door. Through the frosted glass panel beside the doorframe glass she'd helped David pick out because it let in light while maintaining privacy, she could see a shadow, a human silhouette, tall and broad-shouldered. David's silhouette? Her son, standing just feet away from her, separated only by a door and whatever had grown between them in the months of unanswered calls. The footsteps stopped. Eleanor waited, rain dripping from her coat onto the welcome mat that read the Martinez family in cheerful blue letters, a mat she'd given them 3 Christmases ago. Back when she was still invited to family celebrations, back when her gifts were received with genuine gratitude rather than polite obligation. "David," she called again, pressing closer to the door. She could see the shadow shifting, could hear what sounded like whispered conversation from inside. "I can see you there, sweetheart. Please, I'm getting soaked out here." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, betraying the desperation she'd been trying to hide. This wasn't how she'd planned to approach him. She'd imagined arriving during normal evening hours, perhaps with a casserole or cookies as an excuse for the visit. She'd pictured herself composed and dignified, not standing like a drowned rat begging for shelter from her own son. Through the glass, she watched the shadow pause, motionless for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. Then, with a clarity that cut through her denial like lightning through darkness, she watched the shadow turn away. The porch light went out, plunging her back into the storm's darkness. Eleanor stood frozen, her mind refusing to process what had just happened. The storm raged around her, but inside her chest, a different kind of storm was beginning. One made of disbelief and hurt, and a growing realization that the child she'd raised, the boy she'd sacrificed everything for, had just looked directly at her desperation and chosen to walk away. She knocked again, harder this time, her fist pounding against the door with an urgency that bordered on panic. "David, please, it's your mother." But the house had gone quiet, except for the distant murmur of the television being turned back up. Through the living room window, she could see the soft glow resuming, the flicker of movement as her only son settled, back into his comfortable evening while she stood drowning in the storm outside his door. The realization hit her. Like the lightning that split the sky above, he knew she was there. He'd seen her, heard her, and chosen to pretend she didn't exist. Her hands shook from cold, from shock, from the devastating betrayal of it all as she pulled out her phone. Water drops immediately, beating on the screen despite her attempts to shield it under her coat. The device was slippery in her wet fingers as she scrolled to David's number. The same number she'd been calling for weeks. The same number that had been sending her straight to voicemail, with increasingly desperate messages. She hit call and pressed the phone to her ear, watching the house through the rain-blurred windows. Inside, she could see David's silhouette moving across the living room, casually checking his phone as it rang. Once, twice, 3 times, then the familiar click as the call was declined and sent to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached David Martinez. I can't come to the phone right now, but leave a message and I'll get back to you." The recorded voice was cheerful, professional, the voice of a successful businessman who valued communication and customer service. The irony was bitter enough to taste. The beep that followed sounded like a gunshot in the storm. Eleanor took a shuddering breath, wiping rain from her face with the back of her free hand. When she spoke, her voice was steady, despite the chaos around her. Calm, despite the hurricane of emotions tearing through her chest. "David," she said, "it's your mother. It's 8:30 on Tuesday evening, March 15th. I'm standing on your porch right now, and I know you can hear me. I came here tonight because I needed to talk to you about some medical issues I'm having. Important issues. I've been trying to reach you for weeks, 43 calls over the past 2 months, to be exact." Lightning illuminated the street in stark white, and Eleanor saw her reflection in David's front window, a small, soaked figure, abandoned on her own son's doorstep, looking every one of her 73 years. She looked fragile and desperate, and utterly alone, and the sight of herself made her straighten her shoulders with the dignity that had carried her through decades of challenges far worse than wayward children. "I need you to know that I drove here tonight through conditions the Weather Service called life-threatening because I thought my only child would want to know that his mother is facing some serious health decisions. I thought wrong, apparently." Her voice remained controlled, but there was steel underneath now, the backbone that had gotten her through Robert's cancer, through the financial struggles of raising a family on one income, through the small heartbreaks that make up a lifetime of loving someone more than they love you back. "I guess I understand now why you haven't been returning my calls. I'll find my own way home, assuming I can make it through this storm that you've decided I should face alone. But David, ... She paused, watching as a curtain in the living room twitched slightly. Knowing he was listening, knowing he was making the choice to let her drown rather than open the door. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. She ended the call and walked back to her car, each step deliberate, despite the wind, trying to knock her over. As she opened the driver's door, she glanced back at the house one more time. The curtains in the living room twitched slightly, then fell still. The drive home through the flooded streets took 45 minutes. Eleanor's clothes stuck to the leather seats, and she had to pull over twice when the rain became too heavy to see through. But her mind was crystal clear for the first time in months. By the time she pulled into her own driveway, the storm was beginning to ease, but the one brewing inside Eleanor Martinez was just getting started. She sat in her car for a long moment, looking at the house she and Robert had bought 38 years ago with a VA loan and dreams bigger than their bank account. The house where they'd painted nurseries and installed safety gates, where they'd hosted birthday parties and helped with homework, where they'd cried with joy when David got into college, and again when he brought Sarah home to meet them for the first time. The house, that now felt like a mausoleum of memories, filled with photographs of a family that no longer seemed to include her as anything more than an afterthought. But as she sat there, water dripping from her hair and her heart breaking in ways she hadn't experienced since Robert's diagnosis, Eleanor felt something shifting inside her chest. Not breaking, she'd already done enough breaking for one lifetime. This was different. This was hardening, crystallizing, becoming something stronger and more dangerous than the grief she'd been carrying. This was resolve. Eleanor pulled out her phone one more time, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Despite the late hour and the storm, the call was answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Martinez? Is everything all right?" Patricia Chambers had been the Martinez family lawyer for over 15 years, handling everything from David's business incorporation to Robert's will. She was sharp, efficient, and most importantly, she understood that when Eleanor Martinez called at 9:30 on a storm-ravaged Tuesday night, it wasn't for small talk. "Hello, Patricia," Eleanor said, her voice carrying none of the desperation that had marked her conversation with David. This voice was calm, controlled, and quietly furious. "I know it's late, but I need to schedule an appointment. First thing tomorrow morning, if possible." I have some substantial changes to make to my estate planning. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that comes when a lawyer recognizes that a long-standing client relationship is about to take a dramatic turn. Of course, Mrs. Martinez. I can see you at 8 a.m. if that works. Would you like to give me any details now, or would you prefer to discuss everything in person? Eleanor looked toward the direction of David's house, though she couldn't see it through the darkness and rain. In her mind, she could still see his silhouette turning away from her, still feel the shock of that porch light going dark, still taste the bitter realization that the child she'd loved unconditionally had conditions of his own. When it came to loving her back, tomorrow will be fine for the details, she said, stepping out of her car and walking toward her front door with more purpose than she'd felt in months. But, Patricia, clear your schedule. This is going to take a while, and when I'm finished, David is going to learn that there are consequences for treating family like strangers. I understand. Is there anything else you need tonight? Eleanor paused at her front door, keys in hand, and allowed herself one moment of the vulnerability she'd been suppressing. Just when someone shows you who they really are, you should believe them, right? In my experience, Patricia said gently, yes. People's actions in crisis moments tend to reveal their true character. Then I believe my son tonight and tomorrow. I'm going to make sure he understands exactly what he's chosen. As she hung up and unlocked her door, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Anticipation. Not for revenge, she wasn't a vindictive woman by nature, but for justice, for consequences that matched choices. For the kind of lesson that David should have learned decades ago, but had somehow missed along the way. David thought he could dismiss her, ignore her, leave her standing in storms both literal and metaphorical while he lived his comfortable life. He thought his success and his busy schedule and his important adult responsibilities exempted him from the basic obligations of being someone's son. He was about to learn that his mother had weathered far worse storms than the one outside tonight, and she was done being anyone's victim, especially his. The real storm was just beginning, and unlike the weather that had brought her to his door, this one would be entirely of Eleanor's making. Eleanor woke the next morning after exactly 3 hours and 17 minutes of sleep. Not because she'd checked the clock obsessively, but because her mind had spent the night cataloging every detail of the previous evening with the precision of a court stenographer. Each moment was crystalline, the feel of rain soaking through her coat, the sound of David's footsteps approaching and retreating, the sight of his shadow turning away from her desperate plea for help. But more than the events themselves, she remembered the clarity that had come with them. For the first time since Robert's death, she knew exactly what she needed to do. She dressed carefully in her navy blue suit, the one Robert had always said made her look like she could run a Fortune 500 company. Eleanor in that suit could negotiate peace in the Middle East, he used to joke, straightening her collar with the proud tenderness of a man who'd watched his wife handle every crisis their marriage had thrown at them. Today, she needed that power, that presence, that quiet authority that came from 60-plus years of solving problems and surviving disappointments. She arrived at Patricia Chambers' law office 15 minutes early, carrying a leather briefcase. That had belonged to Robert and a manila folder thick with documents she'd spent the early morning hours preparing. The office smelled of leather and old books, mahogany and the faint trace of expensive coffee, the kind of environment designed to make important decisions feel weighty and permanent. At exactly 8 a.m., Eleanor sat across from Patricia at the mahogany conference table that had witnessed decades of Denver's most significant legal decisions. Patricia, a sharp woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that made witnesses nervous in depositions, spread fresh legal documents across the polished surface between them. Eleanor, Patricia said, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses and opening her notebook. I have to ask, before we begin yesterday, you seemed different on the phone. More resolved than I've heard you since Robert's passing. Are you certain about whatever changes you're contemplating? Eleanor set down her manila folder with the deliberate care of someone laying out evidence in a trial. Patricia, let me tell you what happened last night, and then you can decide if I'm being reasonable or if I'm a grief-stricken old woman making decisions from emotion rather than logic. Eleanor pulled a manila folder from her Persa folder she'd spent the early morning hours filling with printed emails, bank statements, and photographs. Patricia, let me tell you what happened last night, and then you can decide if I'm being reasonable. She recounted the story with the precision of a court reporter, each detail delivered without embellishment or emotional manipulation. The weeks of unanswered calls, the mounting medical concerns that required family discussion, the decision to drive through the storm, and the moment her son watched her through the glass and chose to turn away. She spoke of standing in the rain, of making a phone call while drowning on his doorstep, of driving home through floodwaters while her only child settled back into his comfortable evening. Patricia's expression grew more serious with each detail, her pen moving steadily across her legal pad as she took notes. When Eleanor finished, the lawyer set down her pen and removed her glasses, cleaning them with the slow deliberation of someone processing information that challenged her assumptions about human nature. My God, Eleanor, I'm so sorry. I've known David for years through his business dealings, and this seems completely out of character for the man I thought I knew. But are you absolutely sure he saw you? Maybe there was some confusion. Maybe he saw me. Eleanor opened her folder with the calm efficiency of a prosecutor presenting evidence. I have documentation of everything, Patricia. I didn't come here this morning to ask for sympathy or to vent about family problems. I came here to make informed legal decisions based on clear evidence of my son's priorities. She pulled out her phone and set it on the table, the screen displaying her call log. 43 missed calls over the past 2 months. 43 attempts to reach my only son about my health, my finances, my loneliness since Robert died. Every single call went to voicemail. Every text message was ignored. Next came a printed screenshot of her call history, each unanswered attempt highlighted in yellow. And last night, when I called him while standing on his porch, soaking wet, and begging for help, the call went straight to voicemail after 4 rings. Do you know what that means, Patricia? It means he declined the call manually. Exactly. He saw my name on his phone, heard me calling his name through the door, and made the conscious decision to send me to voicemail. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath now. Then I watched the curtains move when I looked back at the house. He was watching me struggle to get to my car in conditions the weather service called life-threatening. Patricia nodded slowly, making additional notes. What exactly do you want to change, Eleanor? Eleanor smiled for the first time since entering the office, not a bitter smile or a vindictive one, but the satisfied expression of someone who had spent hours planning and was ready to execute everything. Patricia, I want to change everything. Over the next 4 hours, they methodically dismantled the will that had left David as the primary beneficiary of Eleanor's substantial estate. The process was more complex than Patricia had initially anticipated because Eleanor's assets were more extensive than many people realized. Robert had been an excellent saver and investor, and Eleanor had continued his careful financial management even after his death. Let's start with the house, Patricia said, pulling up property records on her computer. Current market value is approximately $480,000. Given the improvements you and Robert made over the years and the neighborhood appreciation, the house goes to the Denver homeless shelter, Eleanor said without hesitation. I've already spoken with their director, Margaret Chen. They've been looking for a property to convert into transitional housing for elderly people aging out of the regular shelter system, people like me, who might someday find themselves with nowhere to go when their children decide they're inconvenient. Patricia typed notes into her computer. That's a substantial donation, Eleanor. The tax implications alone, I don't care about taxes. Robert and I bought that house to create a safe place for our family. If David doesn't want to be part of my family, then it should go to people who understand the value of shelter and safety. What about the investment accounts? Eleanor consulted a financial statement from her folder. The mutual funds, stocks, and retirement accounts total approximately $340,000. I want all of it to go to the Colorado Cancer Research Foundation. Robert always said if his insurance money was going to help anyone after we were gone, it should be to fight the disease that took him and the life insurance policy. $200,000 originally intended for David to ease any financial burden after my death. I want it split equally between Emma and Jake's education funds, but held in irrevocable trust. They can't access it until they're 25, and David can never touch it, redirect it, or use it as collateral, ever. Patricia looked up from her computer screen. Eleanor, this will completely disinherit David from your estate. Are you prepared for the legal and emotional consequences of that decision? The consequences? Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter recognition of irony. Patricia, what consequences could be worse than dying alone because your only child can't be bothered to return your calls? What consequences could be worse than standing in a storm while your son pretends you don't exist? She pulled out another set of papers from her folder, documents that made Patricia's eyebrows rise with surprise. Besides, I'm not done yet. We need to discuss the loan. The second phase of Eleanor's plan was more legally complex and potentially more devastating to David's comfortable life. She'd spent the early morning hours researching David's business, Martinez Construction LLC, the successful company he'd built from nothing into a multi-million-dollar operation that employed 37 people and handled some of Denver's most prestigious commercial projects. I want to call in the loan, Eleanor said simply, sliding the faded document across the mahogany table. Patricia picked up the yellowed paper and examined it. with the careful attention she'd give to a contract in $1 million litigation. Eleanor, what loan? I don't recall the money I gave David to start his business 15 years ago wasn't a gift. Patricia, it was a loan. We drew up the paperwork right here in this office, with you as the notarizing witness. David was supposed to pay it back once the business became profitable. Patricia's memory clicked into place as she studied the document. I remember now, but Eleanor, this is from 15 years ago. Surely the statute of limitations hasn't expired. I checked. And please look at Clause 7, Section C. Patricia read aloud, her voice growing quieter as she understood the implications. In the event of non-payment beyond the agreed-upon grace period, interest compounds annually at 8%, calculated from the date of initial disbursement. Eleanor, with compound interest over 15 years, this loan is now worth $158,734.16, Eleanor finished, consulting a calculator printout from her folder. I calculated it 3 times this morning to be certain. The office fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on Patricia's bookshelf and the distant sound of Denver traffic beginning the morning rush. Patricia stared at the document, then at Eleanor, then back at the document, as if the numbers might change if she looked at them enough times. You want to collect on this now? Patricia asked carefully. I want to give him a choice, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had thought through every angle. He can pay back what he owes his mother, what he has always owed his mother war. He can explain to his family, his business partners, and his employees why the company is in financial jeopardy because he never honored his obligations to the woman who made his success possible. Patricia made notes, but Eleanor could see the concern in her lawyer's expression. The professional worry of someone who understood that families could be destroyed by legal weapons, even when those weapons were technically justified. Eleanor, I have to ask this as both your lawyer and someone who's watched your family for years. Is this about revenge? Because if it is, I need to advise you that revenge through legal channels often destroys the person seeking it as much as the target. Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Outside the office windows, Denver was coming alive with the energy of a new day, people heading to work, meeting friends for coffee, calling their parents to check in, living normal lives where children didn't abandon their mothers in storms. No, she said finally, her voice carrying absolute conviction. It's not about revenge. It's about consequences. David has spent the last 2 years treating me like I'm already dead. He's ignored my calls, avoided family gatherings, and last night he proved that his comfort matters more than my safety. So I'm going to give him exactly what he seems to want, a world where I don't exist in his life as anything but a financial obligation. She pulled out the final item from her folder, a sealed envelope with David's name written in her careful cursive handwriting. The same handwriting that had signed his permission slips and birthday cards for 37 years. But first, he's going to understand exactly what he's lost. And more importantly, he's going to understand that actions have consequences, even when those actions are neglect and indifference. Patricia finished documenting the new will by noon, each page reviewed and signed with the formality that such life-changing decisions required. The loan collection notice was prepared for legal delivery, complete with certified mail requirements and formal demand language that would make David's accountant's blood pressure spike. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She had one more stop to make. One more piece of her plan that required careful execution. She drove to the storage unit she'd rented that morning, climate-controlled space across town where she could work without the emotional weight of being surrounded by 40 years of memories in her own home. She spent 3 hours going through boxes of photographs, home videos, and mementos from David's childhood that she'd carefully preserved through decades of moves and life changes. Every birthday party she'd thrown, complete with hand-decorated cakes and carefully planned games. Every baseball game she'd attended, even the ones where David spent more time picking dandelions than watching the ball. Every school play she'd videotaped, often staying late to help with costumes or props. Every moment of love and sacrifice that had shaped her son into the successful man, who no longer had time for the woman who'd made it all possible. She selected the most meaningful items. With the precision of a museum curator, photos of David's first steps, taken on a sunny Tuesday morning when he'd suddenly let go of the coffee table and walked 3 steps to her waiting arms. His high school graduation, where she'd cried during his valedictorian speech about the importance of family support. His wedding day, where she'd walked him down the aisle because Robert was already too weak from cancer treatments to manage the distance. There were videos of Christmas mornings from when David was 5, 8, 12, his face lighting up with joy that was as much about her presence as the presents under the tree. Report cards she'd saved. Not just the good ones, but the struggles too. Evidence of her patience through his difficult algebra phase and her celebration when he finally mastered the concepts. artwork from elementary school, carefully dated and preserved stick figure families where she was always drawn bigger than anyone else. Because mom is the most important, he'd explained with 6-year-old logic. A Father's Day card he'd made for Robert but signed from David and Mom because we're a team. And then, at the bottom of one box, she found the letter that nearly broke her resolve. A handwritten note from David when he was 12, struggling with the social dynamics of middle school and the recent diagnosis of Robert's cancer. "Dear Mom," she read aloud in the empty storage unit, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You are the best mom in the whole world. I know Dad is sick, and you're scared, but you still help me with homework and make my lunch and come to my games. When I grow up, I want to take care of you like you take care of me and Dad. I love you more than all the stars in the sky and all the fish in the ocean. You're my hero. Love, David." The letter was written in the careful cursive of a 12, trying to express emotions bigger than his vocabulary, decorated with small drawings of hearts and stars. At the bottom, he'd drawn their family, 3 stick figures holding hands, with the Martinez family written underneath in block letters. Eleanor sat in the storage unit for a long moment, holding the letter and remembering the boy who had written it. That boy had grown up to be a man who could watch his mother drown in a storm without opening his door. The transformation was so complete it felt like a death, and in a way it was. The David who had written this letter was gone, replaced by someone who valued success over relationships, comfort over compassion. But even as her heart broke for the loss of that boy, her resolve hardened. If David had forgotten who he used to be, perhaps it was time to remind him. If he had forgotten what she had sacrificed for him, maybe seeing the evidence would jar something loose in his conscience. She carefully placed each item in a large banker's box, arranging them chronologically so that David would experience the full arc of their relationship from his childhood, dependence on her love to his adult dismissal of it. Along with the photographs and mementos, she included copies of her new will, the loan collection notice, and documentation of every unanswered call over the past 2 months. At the very top of the box, she placed the sealed letter she'd written during her sleepless night, 10 pages of careful script that would either wake up her son's conscience or serve as her final goodbye to the relationship she had treasured above all others. The storm outside had passed, leaving Denver washed clean and gleaming in the afternoon sunshine. But the storm Eleanor was creating would reshape everything David thought he knew about consequences, about family, and about the woman who'd given him everything and asked for so little in return. As she locked the storage unit and drove to the courier service that would deliver her carefully constructed hurricane to David's office, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Anticipation, not for revenge, but for justice. Not for destruction, but for truth. David had made his choice when he left her standing in that storm. Now it was time for him to live with the consequences of that choice, and to discover what it felt like to be on the receiving end of indifference from someone whose love he had taken for granted. The real storm was about to make landfall. And, unlike the weather that had brought them to this point, this tempest would be entirely of Eleanor's design. 3 weeks passed before Eleanor made her next move, and she used every day to gather intelligence with the methodical patience of a general planning a campaign. She drove past David's construction sites during her morning errands, noting which projects seemed most critical, which deadlines appeared to be causing stress among the workers. She researched his business partnerships through public records available at the county courthouse, learning about contracts and commitments that could be vulnerable to financial pressure. She even befriended Martha Thompson, the chatty secretary, at David's business complex during a carefully orchestrated chance encounter at the King Soopers grocery store where Martha did her weekly shopping every Thursday afternoon. "Oh, you're Mrs. Martinez," Martha had exclaimed when Eleanor introduced herself, her face lighting up with recognition. "David talks about you all the time. You must be so proud of what he's accomplished with the business." Eleanor had smiled and nodded, playing the role of the proud mother while carefully steering the conversation toward useful information. "I certainly am, though I worry he works too hard." "How has he seemed lately?" "Oh, stressed as always," Martha had confided over coffee in the store's small cafe, completely unaware she was talking to David's estranged mother. "That Riverside Shopping Center project has been keeping him up nights. It's a huge contract, the biggest we've ever taken on, but the timeline is so tight. If they don't finish by the end of March, they lose a $250,000 completion bonus. And with all the rain delays we've had this month," Martha had shaken her head sympathetically. "Plus his wife Sarah mentioned at the Christmas party that he's been working late every night, missing family dinners, even skipped his daughter's piano recital last week. I felt terrible for her." Eleanor absorbed every detail with the patience of a chess player planning 10 moves ahead. When she finally acted, it would be with surgical precision that would cut deep enough to get David's attention, but not so deep as to destroy innocent people, like his employees or the subcontractors who depended on his business for their livelihoods. The first strike came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the storm. David was reviewing blueprints in his office, trying to solve a foundation issue that threatened to delay the Riverside project even further, when his assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Martinez, there's a process server here to see you." David's first thought was that one of their subcontractors was suing over a payment dispute. It had happened before in the construction business. His second thought was that maybe a client was unhappy with some aspect of their work. His stomach clenched with anxiety as he accepted the legal documents, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw when he read the header. Notice of Loan Collection Eleanor Martinez versus David Martinez. The words blurred together as he tried to process what he was seeing. His mother's name, his name. Legal terminology that made his hands shake as he read. Demand for immediate payment of outstanding loan principal and accrued interest in the amount of $158,734.16. "This can't be right," he muttered, his voice barely audible in the sudden silence of his office. The bustling sounds of the construction company phones ringing. Conversations about materials and schedules, the constant hum of productivity seemed to fade into background noise as he reread the document 3 times, hoping the words would change. 15 years ago, $50,000. Compound interest at 8% annually. Total amount due, $158,734.16. Payment demanded within 30 days or legal action. Would proceed to collection, potentially including liens against business assets and personal property. David's mind raced back to the beginning of his business, to the days when he'd been working construction for other companies while dreaming of starting his own. He remembered the conversation with his mother in this very office, though it had been in a different building then. A small rented space that smelled like sawdust and ambition. "Mom, I found the perfect opportunity," he'd said, spreading architectural plans across her kitchen table. "There's a small commercial project that could be my first independent contract, but I need startup capital for equipment and initial materials." "How much?" she'd asked, not hesitating, not questioning whether his business plan was sound or his experience sufficient. $50,000, I know it's a lot, and I wouldn't ask if consider it done," Eleanor had said, already reaching for her checkbook. "Robert and I believe in you, David. We know you'll be successful." He remembered signing papers had they been loan documents. In his excitement and gratitude, he'd signed whatever Patricia put in front of him, focused more on the miracle of his mother's faith in him than the legal specifics of their arrangement. In his mind, the money had been a gift, a generous gesture from parents who wanted to see their son succeed. But apparently, the law saw it differently. David pulled out his phone with trembling hands and called his lawyer, then his accountant, then his business partner, Jake Morrison. Each conversation brought the same conclusion. The document appeared to be legally sound, the debt technically valid, and the demand for payment would severely strain their cash flow at the worst possible time. "Dave, I don't understand," Jake said over lunch at their usual spot near the office, reviewing the legal papers with the stunned expression of someone watching a natural disaster unfold. "Your mom has always been so supportive of the business. She came to our ribbon-cutting ceremony, sent cookies to the office every Christmas, until... When did those stop coming, anyway?" David couldn't answer the question because he couldn't remember. When his mother's small gestures of support had faded from his life? When had her Christmas cookies stopped arriving? When had he stopped inviting her to company events? When had her proud attendance at his business milestones become an obligation rather than a celebration? The memories blurred together, of being too busy to visit, too stressed to call back promptly, too focused on building his empire, to notice that he'd been systematically excluding the woman who'd made it all possible. "What are you going to do?" Jake asked, his concern evident in every line of his weathered face. "I guess I'll have to call her," David said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a phone call and an apology. This was a calculated move by someone who had been pushed too far and was finally pushing back. That evening, David finally worked up the courage to call his mother. The phone rang 8 times before going to voicemail, a recording he'd heard dozens of times, but never really listened to. "Hello, you've reached Eleanor Martinez. I'm unable to take your call right now, but please leave a detailed message and I'll return your call when I have time. Thank you." The formal tone, so different from the warm maternal voice he remembered from his childhood, sent a chill down his spine. When had she started sounding like a stranger? "Mom, it's David," he said after the beep, his voice cracking slightly. "I got the ... the legal papers today. I don't understand what's happening. Can we please talk about this? I'll come by the house tonight after dinner, and we can work this out. But when he arrived at his childhood home at 8 p.m., all the lights were off and his mother's car wasn't in the driveway. He knocked anyway, calling through the door like she had done at his house 3 weeks earlier, but got no response. The house stood silent and dark. As unwelcoming as he had been on that storm-ravaged night, he tried calling again from her driveway, watching the dark windows for any sign of movement. The call went straight to voicemail. "Mom, I'm here at the house, but you're not home. Please, I need to talk to you about this loan thing. I know I haven't been a good son lately, but we can fix this. We're family." The words sounded hollow even to him, echoing in the empty driveway where he'd played basketball as a teenager, where she'd taught him to change a tire, where she'd hugged him goodbye when he left for college, with tears in her eyes and pride in her voice. The second strike came 3 days later, and it hit even harder than the first. David was on the Riverside job site, arguing with a concrete contractor about delivery schedules, when his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Emergency at home. Come now." He arrived to find Sarah crying at the kitchen table, surrounded by opened mail and legal documents that covered the surface like the aftermath of a paper explosion. "David, what the hell is going on?" she demanded, holding up an official-looking letter that shook in her trembling hands. "Why is your mother's lawyer contacting Emma and Jake's schools about their trust funds?" David felt the world tilt sideways. "What trust funds?" Sarah threw the papers at him, her movement sharp with anger and confusion. "Apparently your mother set up college trust funds for the kids years ago, funds we never knew about, and now she's changing the terms. The money can't be accessed until they're 25 instead of 18, and only if they maintain a relationship with her." David read the documents with growing horror, each line revealing another layer of his ignorance about his own family's finances. His mother had been quietly depositing money into accounts for Emma and Jake for over a decade. The funds now totaled nearly $80,000 each, money that could have paid for their entire college educations. Money that represented years of careful saving and sacrifice by a grandmother they barely knew existed. "There's more," Sarah said, her voice breaking with emotion. "She's also been volunteering at their schools. Emma's art teacher says your mother has been helping in the classroom twice a week for 3 years. 3 years, David. And Jake's soccer coach says she's been coming to practices and games since he started playing in middle school." "That's impossible," David said, but even as he spoke, he knew it wasn't. "We would have known, would we?" Sarah stood up, pacing the kitchen with the restless energy of someone whose world had just been turned upside down. "When was the last time you went to one of Jake's games? When was the last time you visited Emma's classroom? Your mother has been more involved in our children's lives than you have, and we never even noticed because we were too busy, too focused on work, too ... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but David could fill in the blanks. Too selfish, too self-absorbed, too convinced that their busy adult lives exempted them from paying attention to the people who loved them. "The kids are asking questions," Sarah continued, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Emma wants to know why Grandma Eleanor suddenly can't come to her art class anymore. Jake's wondering why she missed his game yesterday for the first time in 2 years. What am I supposed to tell them?" David didn't have an answer. His phone buzzed with another call from his lawyer, another crisis at the job site, another demand for his attention that had always taken precedence over his family. But for the first time in years, he ignored it all and focused on the devastation in his wife's eyes. "I have to fix this," he said, but the words sounded weak even to him. "How?" Sarah's voice rose with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You've been ignoring your mother for months. She's been trying to reach you, trying to stay connected to this family, and you've been treating her like she's already dead." The words hit David like a physical blow, partly because they were cruel, but mostly because they were true. In his pursuit of success, his focus on building a business and providing for his family, he had systematically excluded the woman who had given him everything. "And David," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more devastating than her shouting, "she called me the morning after that storm 3 weeks ago. She was worried about you, thought maybe something had happened since you didn't answer the door. I told her you'd been home all evening watching Netflix with us." The memory hit David like lightning, the doorbell during the storm, the figure on the porch that he'd dismissed as a solicitor or someone who was lost, the voice calling his name that he'd assumed was just wind and rain, his mother soaked and desperate, begging for help while he'd been comfortable on his couch, deciding she wasn't worth the interruption of his evening routine. "Oh God," he whispered, sinking into a chair as the full weight of his actions settled over him. "Oh God, what have I done?" The memory played in vivid, horrifying detail, his mother's voice calling through the door, her small figure visible through the frosted glass, the moment he'd consciously chosen to turn away and return to his television program. She hadn't been a stranger or a solicitor, she'd been his 73-year-old mother, standing in a dangerous storm because she needed her son's help, and he had left her there to drown. "I need to call her," he said, reaching for his phone, but Sarah caught his hand. "She won't answer," she said quietly. "I've been trying to reach her for 3 days. She's not responding to anyone." David looked at his wife, freely looked at her, and saw not just anger but disappointment. The kind of deep moral disappointment that comes when you realize the person you married is capable of cruelty you never imagined. "The kids want to see her," Sarah continued. "They're asking when Grandma Eleanor is coming to dinner again, when she's going to help Emma with her art project, when she's going to watch Jake's championship game next week. They don't understand why she's suddenly not part of their lives. Anymore, she's been coming to his games, every single one. David, home and away. She sits in the same spot in the bleachers, cheers for every kid on the team, brings oranges for halftime. Jake told me yesterday that she's been his good luck charm since 6th grade. David felt like he was drowning in his own ignorance, suffocating under the weight of all the love and attention he'd been too busy to notice. His mother hadn't just been calling about her own loneliness and medical issues. She'd been trying to maintain connections with his entire family while he'd been systematically cutting her out of their lives. But Eleanor Martinez wasn't finished. Delivering her lessons about consequences and family loyalty, the third and final strike was already in motion, and when it landed, it would shatter everything David thought he knew about the cost of taking the people who love you for granted, would change everything David thought he knew about the cost of neglecting the people who love you most. The final blow came on a Friday afternoon, delivered not by lawyers or legal documents but by David's own children. Emma burst through the front door after school, her 13-year-old face streaked with tears. "Dad, is Grandma Eleanor sick? Mrs. Henderson says she's not coming back to help with art class." And when I asked why, she got all weird and sad. Before David could answer, 15-year-old Jake stormed in behind his sister. "Coach Williams pulled me aside after practice. He wanted to know if Grandma was okay because she's donated the money for our new uniforms every year. But this year she told him to find another sponsor." "Dad, what did you do?" David felt like he was drowning. Over the past week, the full scope of his mother's involvement in their lives had become clear through conversations with teachers, coaches, and neighbors. Eleanor had been quietly supporting his family in dozens of ways he'd never noticed, paying for school supplies, sponsoring team equipment, volunteering her time, being present for his children when he was too busy to be there himself. "Kids, sit down," Sarah said gently. "We need to talk." The family gathered in the living room where David had been sitting 3 weeks ago when his mother stood in the storm outside their door. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Your dad and I need to explain something about Grandma Eleanor," Sarah began. But Emma interrupted. "Is she dying? Is that why she's acting weird?" "No, sweetheart," David said, his voice cracking. "She's not dying. But I made some mistakes. Big mistakes. And Grandma is hurt because of things I did." "What kind of mistakes?" Jake asked, his teenage skepticism evident. David looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw so much of his mother in the boy's earnest brown eyes. How had he never noticed that before? "I stopped paying attention to her," David admitted. "I got so busy with work and ... and I forgot that she needed me. When she tried to call me, I didn't call back. When she needed help, I wasn't there. And 3 weeks ago when she came here in that terrible storm, I didn't answer the door because I thought it was someone I didn't want to deal with." Emma gasped. "Grandma was here during the storm, the night the power went out." "Yes. And you left her outside?" Jake's voice rose with adolescent outrage. "Dad, she's old. She could have been hurt." "I know." David buried his face in his hands. "I know, and I can't take it back." Sarah pulled a manila envelope from the side table. Had arrived that morning by certified mail. "Your grandmother sent this for all of us to read together." With shaking hands, David opened the envelope and found a letter written in his mother's careful script, along with copies of documents that made his blood run cold. The new will, the trust fund modifications, and at the bottom, a collection of photographs that told the story of 38 years of motherhood that he'd somehow forgotten. "Dear David, Sarah, Emma, and Jake," David read aloud, his voice barely steady. "If you're reading this, then you've begun to understand the consequences of choices made over the past 2 years. David, I want you to know that I don't hate you. I'm not angry. I'm heartbroken, but not in the way you might think. I'm not heartbroken because you ignored my calls or left me in a storm, though both of those things hurt more than you can imagine. I'm heartbroken because somewhere along the way, you forgot who we used to be to each other. You forgot that I was the one who stayed up with you every night when you had pneumonia at age 7. You forgot that I worked 2 jobs to pay for your college when your father got sick. You forgot that I was the one who believed in your business idea when everyone else said you were crazy, and I gave you the money that started everything you have now. But most of all, you forgot that I wasn't just asking for your help these past months. I was trying to give you mine. The medical appointments I wanted to discuss weren't just about me being scared. I wanted to talk to you about advanced directives and end-of-life planning because I wanted to spare you and your family the confusion and pain I went through when your father died without clear instructions. The loneliness I called about wasn't just selfishness. I was hoping you might want to know about the volunteering I'd been doing with Emma and Jake, the college funds I'd been building for them, the ways I'd been trying to stay connected to the family. That means everything to me. You thought I was a burden calling for help. I was actually calling to offer it, Sarah. Emma, Jake, I want you to know that David is a good man who made bad choices. We all do that sometimes. The difference is whether we learn from our mistakes or repeat them. The changes I've made to my will and the money I'm asking David to repay aren't about punishment. They're about teaching a lesson that I should have taught years ago. That family isn't something you put on a shelf and dust off when it's convenient. It requires attention, care, and reciprocity. Emma, I have loved watching you grow into such a talented artist. Your painting of the sunset that hangs in my kitchen has brought me joy every single day for 2 years. I hope you'll keep creating beautiful things that make the world brighter, Jake. You have your grandfather's determination and your father's intelligence. But more than that, you have kindness. I've seen how you help your teammates and include kids who might otherwise be left out. That matters more than any trophy. The trust funds I establish for both of you will be available when you turn 25. Not because I want to control you, but because I want you to understand the value of patience and planning. The money represents not just my love for you, but the importance of thinking beyond immediate gratification. David, you have 30 days to decide how you want to handle the loan repayment. You also have the rest of your life to decide what kind of son, husband, and father you want to be. I won't be calling anymore. I won't be dropping by unannounced. I won't be volunteering at the schools or sponsoring team activities. Not because I don't love you all, but because I've learned that my presence in your lives needs to be wanted, not just tolerated. If you want a relationship with me, you'll need to make the effort. Real effort. Not a guilty phone call after you. Get legal papers, but genuine investment in knowing who I am and what I need. Just as I've always tried to know and support who you are. The storm that brought us to this point is over. What grows in its aftermath is up to you. All my love, always. Mom, Grandma, Eleanor P.S. The box being delivered with this letter contains every photo, video, and memento from David's childhood that I've saved over the years. I thought it might help you remember who we used to be to each other and decide who you want to be going forward. The living room fell silent except for the sound of Emma crying quietly. Jake stared at the photographs scattered on the coffee table, images of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, baseball games and school plays, a lifetime of love carefully preserved by a grandmother they'd barely known was there. Dad, Jake said finally, his voice thick with emotion. You have to fix this. I don't know if I can, David whispered. I don't know if she'll forgive me. Sarah took his hand. Then you better figure out how to deserve her forgiveness. Over the next week, David liquidated investments, took out a business loan, and scraped together every dollar he could find. On the 28th day after receiving the collection notice, he drove to his mother's house with a cashier's check for $158,734.16. But Eleanor's car wasn't in the driveway, and when he knocked, a neighbor informed him that Mrs. Martinez had left for an extended trip to visit her sister in Arizona. She said she needed a change of scenery, the neighbor explained. Didn't say when she'd be back. David left the check in an envelope under her door, along with a letter of his own 10 pages of apologies, memories, and promises that he wasn't sure he deserved the chance to keep. 3 months later, Eleanor returned to Denver, but she didn't call. Instead, David found himself in the position of being the one making unanswered phone calls, the one driving by hoping to catch a glimpse of her car, the one leaving voicemails that might or might not be returned. The role reversal was complete, and David was finally learning what his mother had felt for 2 years. Desperation of loving someone who had no time for you. But love, David was discovering, sometimes requires you to prove you've changed before you get the chance to make amends. And his mother, who had weathered 73 years of life's storms, was in no hurry to let him back into her shelter. The real question wasn't whether Eleanor would forgive him. The question was whether David would do the work to become worthy of that forgiveness, not through grand gestures or guilty money, but through the daily choice to put family first, to stay connected, to remember that love requires maintenance like anything else worth keeping. As he sat in his car outside his mother's house for the 4th time that week, watching her kitchen light flicker on as evening fell, David finally understood what his Mother had been trying to teach him all along. Some storms come from the sky and pass in a few hours. Others come from the heart and change everything they touch. The choice of which kind of storm you create, and how you rebuild after it passes, defines not just who you are, but who you choose to become. Eleanor Martinez had created her storm with surgical precision, not to destroy her son, but to wake him up before it was too late to save what mattered most. Whether he would prove worthy of that salvation remained to be seen. But, for the first time in years, David was finally paying attention to the answer that mattered most, the one his mother would give him, when she was ready to give it. The storm had passed. The rebuilding was just beginning.